Welcome to the Quality of Life Lecture Series presented by the College of Human Sciences and Education at Louisiana State University. And I actually have written down, welcome not only to you here in the theater, but those of you joining us through the miracle of technology. That seems a little ironic. Yeah. I'm Carol Berry, Director of the School of Library and Information Science, and I'm going to be very pleased to welcome our speakers, Trudy Jacobson and Tom Mackey, for their presentation, Teaching Meta-Literacy to Empower Learners in a Post-Truth World. But before I move on to introductions, I have a few housekeeping details, which I think still apply. Take a moment to double check and silence your electronic devices. As you can see from the microphones hanging from the ceiling, this theater employs an active microphone system to facilitate discussion. As such, everything said in the room by speakers and audience members is amplified, and I assume will be on the recording. So don't say anything to your seatmate that you don't want the whole world to hear about. Okay. Another feature of the theater, there are outlets running underneath the seats. Although those are convenient for charging devices, they don't react well to liquids, so absolutely no beverages in the room. And again, this event is being recorded. So if you have a question that you would like to ask, but you don't want your actual voice recorded asking the question, you can write it and pass it to Dr. Benoit, except he's left, so you could pass it to me even, and we would deal with that. Okay. And I do want to thank the Center for Computational Technology for giving us access to this venue. Okay. Last night someone asked me how I had made the decision to ask Trudy and Tom to be here today, which worked in lovely for an introduction. I knew that we wanted to do something about the fake news phenomena and how we can address that. So I did what anyone would do. I Googled fake news to see what would come up. And these two names kept appearing over and over and over again with this thing about a meta-literacy framework and books and articles and a meta-literacy MOOC. Their approach has been covered in newspapers across the country, on National Public Radio. They've done presentations nationally and internationally on this. So I pretty much knew that we wanted these innovative experts to come and discuss this today. So telling you a little bit about them. Trudy Jacobson is head of the Information Literacy Department at the University of Albany and holds the rank of Distinguished Librarian. She co-chaired the Association of College and Research Libraries Task Force that created the Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education, is a member of the editorial board of Communications and Information Literacy, and freelances as an acquisitions editor for Rowan & Littlefield's Innovations in Information Literacy series. And Trudy has published extensively and won the 2009 National ACRL Instruction Section Miriam Dudley Instruction Librarian Award. Tom Mackey is Professor of Humanities and the Arts at SUNY Empire State College. His research examines meta-literacy as an empowering model for innovative teaching and learning. He's a member of the editorial team for Open Praxis, the open access peer-reviewed academic journal about open, distance, and flexible education that is published by the International Council for Open and Distance Education. And he's also a member of the advisory board for Progressio, a South African journal for open and distance learning practice. So please join me in welcoming our speakers today.
Thank you very much, Carol. We're delighted to be here. The hospitality has been just marvelous. And we're so glad that you Googled and found us.
Well, thank you. Me too.
So what we're going to talk about today, sort of segmented, Tom will primarily be talking about the post-truth world. We'll be talking more about what meta-literacy is, teaching to sort of encourage meta-literacy in learners, And then at the end, a segment on information literacy, librarians, and then collaborations between librarians and disciplinary faculty members with lots of time for questions and, we hope, answers.
We want to mention too that we just revised the meta-literacy learning goals and objectives, so everyone here has a copy of that, and we just posted these via the metaliteracy.org website, and we're seeking feedback right now. So we revised these for the first time since 2014, and we want to hear your comments about it. And the presentation will include several references to the goals and objectives.
And what you see here is a diagram with the attributes of a meta-literate individual. These are sort of the primary characteristics of meta-literacy, and go anywhere from being informed, collaborative, participatory, and I will let you continue to read those. This is just to give you a sense about meta-literacy, and we will be talking more about it later in the presentation.
So let's provide some context in terms of where we are with the post-truth world. We've been working with meta-literacy now for some time, since I think 2010. We published our first article in 2011, and things have certainly changed. And we've really been talking about this and writing about it and thinking about it, but because of some of the changes, and we did write that article about fake news as soon as as a result of the 2016 election in particular. So let's look at where we are now, and I think a lot of this will look familiar to everyone, and we'd like to hear your feedback on this as well. It really was a turning point that in 2016, Oxford Dictionaries actually considered post-truth the word of the year. Not necessarily a good thing, but it is the word of the year because it was discussed so much that previous year. So let's take a look at the definition, because I do think that this definition will come up quite a bit as well in what we talk about today. So it relates to or denotes circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion, that appeals to emotion and personal belief. So embedded in there are some issues that we'll be discussing today in terms of confirmation bias and how people respond at an emotional level to information rather than sort of just facts. And we also know now that just facts doesn't go far enough. So in many ways, this is an argument for the meta-literacy framework we've been describing and developing, because the meta-literacy framework is really looking at the whole person. It's really looking at those 4 domains of learning that we'll go into later on. And what's interesting too, we are currently working on a new book, The Meta-Literate Learner in the Post-Truth World, and we're developing the framing chapter for this. So it was an opportunity to dig a little bit deeper. And it is interesting that the term has been around since 1992. And Steve Tesich is this writer who first coined the phrase, and he really puts us within political, societal context. And I think this is a really important quote. He says that he said in a very fundamental way, we, as a free people, have freely decided that we want to live in some post-truth world. So that might surprise us because we are so outraged by all of these things. But he really shifts the emphasis to sort of what is our responsibility as a society and as a culture and as individuals. And he talks about such, looking at this from a historical context in terms of the Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, the pardoning of Richard Nixon, for example. All of these things, these significant historical events that have just chipped away at individuals' trust in authority and truth, the truth as an authority. And interestingly, Ralph Keyes wrote a book on this idea of the post-truth world, and his quote is that post-truthfulness exists in an ethical twilight zone. It allows us to dissemble without considering ourselves dishonest. And he really talks about, in many ways, how we have changed the meaning of what even the word lie means. That instead of saying lie, we'll say things like, exercising poor judgment, exaggerate, or spin, which is clearly a word that's used almost daily these days. And again, this shifts, the responsibility back on us and what is our responsibility for this happening. And again, this was 2004. he was looking at a much broader societal change that he was seeing in terms of how people understand truth. And again, this idea of post-truth is also very much a kind of postmodern notion, the fact that it is something that happens after. So with postmodernism, it was this idea that, you know, modernism really was this kind of linear historical narrative, and postmodernism really changed that and challenged that. And we'll get to that in a second as well. Fake news is clearly another result of the post-truth world. It's probably one of the most contested terms. In fact, when we were writing about it, it meant one thing, and now it's been used for political purposes to mean something quite different than what we were talking about. So the term itself has been appropriated to mean something very different. So when we were talking about it, it really was misinformation, misleading information, blatantly false information that circulates on the web, that's created for the web and social media, that does not have the traditional journalistic editorial filters that we would normally have. So in many ways, the web was seen as this democratic space where anyone can say anything, but now we're really looking at that in a different way, because what happens when you don't have some of those traditional editorial filters, and I think that we're really seeing that now. So that's the term fake news. This article from this team from Dartmouth is really important because their research it's really the first research study that looks at not just survey information, but also web history, so data sets, to really see what people were looking at, which websites they were coming from, where they were going, and then combining that with survey information. So it wasn't just their opinion about things, it was really looking at sort of the histories involved. And what's interesting here is that they have three major findings that, again, we'll delve into further, but it's something to think about. So first, they say that most of the fake news websites, the production and consumption of it, was overwhelmingly pro-Trump in its orientation. So there are many things that we can arrive at that, we can conclude from that point. One is this idea of confirmation bias, which is that people tend to gravitate toward information that affirms their own beliefs. And they've been really adamant that we have to be very careful that we look at this problem. Their point is that it doesn't necessarily mean that it changed the outcome of the election, because their point is that most people who were going to these websites were already in favor of Trump. So that's key. So again, we have to be very careful about some of the assumptions we make. Second point, which we've been hearing certainly a lot about this last week, as Mark Zuckerberg has been in front of the Senate and the House talking, is that Facebook has definitely provided a key role in directing people to fake news. Again, not surprising, I think we all know this now, but it's really something important to be thinking about, that really was the key interface where this was happening. And of course, as the web has expanded, as Facebook's presence has expanded, again, that's not particularly surprising, but they were able to look at sort of the impact of this one platform on how people were accessing information. And then I think this last point, I think, is really key for us as educators, because again, it challenges what some of our assumptions would be about facts and truth. So they found that fact-checking really failed to effectively counter fake news. And there are a few interesting reasons for that. Again, one, confirmation bias. Someone just believes something to be true. It doesn't matter if you're representing it to them or challenging it with factual information. So that's why in a post-truth world, in many ways, we have to get past facts, because that's not going to be the easy solution to this. Also, this idea that if you present someone with a fact check, so people will walk away from that with the original piece of information that you presented to them, and not just the correction. So again, there's some complexity to all of these issues that really require us as educators even to go beyond our disciplines, because now we're looking at things that are much more cognitive and behavioral research that are not necessarily within our domain, but it really requires educators to be thinking in interdisciplinary terms. And this is something that we've referred to previously, the Stanford research, which was actually before the election. And this particular finding is not too surprising. I think anyone teaching today has a good sense of this, that students, they definitely know the latest technologies, or digital natives know the latest technologies. They're working with Facebook, they're working with Twitter, Instagram. But even though there's that, and this is not just students, it's really the digital natives is what they're looking at, but I think this is really true for everybody. Just because you can use a cell phone and use the latest app doesn't mean you can't be easily duped. So they found that even if you have those technical proficiencies, that people are still easily duped. And again, another argument for meta-literacy, because meta-literacy certainly goes beyond just understanding the technology. It's again looking at this whole person. And another finding that they asserted, which is so relevant today, is this idea that at present we worry that democracy is threatened by the ease at which disinformation about civic issues is allowed to spread and flourish. So I think this is something that has certainly been part of the conversation today of really how dangerous these kinds of issues are and these kinds of trends are. And now this is the first assertion. The top part here is is really the first goal and objective in the revised meta-literacy goals and objectives, which is actively evaluate content while also evaluating one's own biases. So you can see how we arrived at that given sort of what I've already presented about the post-truth world. And previously in meta-literacy, we had talked about the importance of really evaluating dynamic online content, but we've revised that to take into account this more reflective practice of having people think about this. And this is an example of really what many people see as a kind of threat to democracy. I'm sure many people saw this video when Sinclair Media required local journalists, local TV anchors to recite the same script. So it's really the first time something like this has happened, and it really challenges sort of the autonomy of the local journalists, the local anchors. And we're not going to show the video, you've probably seen it, but if you haven't, I would strongly encourage you to check it out because it is really compelling because it shows all these local anchors, nearly 100 of them from around the country, reciting the same exact script from Sinclair. So really, and what's interesting about it, it's this whole tension between how do we define fake news, because they're talking about false information, but in many ways it's the current administration perspective that they're describing in terms of what fake news is and what false information is. So a lot of people found this very alarming, and the video, which went viral, further emphasized that point. And what's interesting about that too, I think, is that we have to be very careful that misinformation easily circulates online, but so do really valuable videos like this that critique some of the issues that are happening in the online space. Trudy's now going to talk about confirmation bias, which I hinted at, but she can go into this a little bit further.
Yeah, so as Tom mentioned, he has talked a little bit about this. So our viewpoints are really a lens through which we focus on the information that we consider as valid, but also the information that we seek out and find. And evidence to the contrary really isn't considered so much. So it really takes a consciousness of this tendency to look for the kind of information that affirms your own beliefs in order to try to counter that. And we're going to be talking about metacognition, which is one of the learning domains of meta-literacy, and that will sort of really have an effect on this.
And this was really an excellent piece written by Andrew Kirkpatrick, this quote here. So he talks about understanding the post-truth world comprehension and with an emphasis on empathy and understanding. So again, trying to think of how do we respond to all of this? How do we get beyond these echo chambers, which the Dartmouth group, one of my favorite quotes from that, they said that the echo chambers are really deep. The fact that most pro-Trump supporters were gravitating toward the fake news indicated that the echo chambers are really deep. So how do we get beyond that? And Kirkpatrick really talks about sort of this notion of the postmodern condition, which again is a really positive thing because it's really challenging some of these traditional narratives. But what he's saying is that then we have these little narratives that are impenetrable, where everyone's in their own little narrative, these bastions of certainty, and unable to cross the divide. We are in such a highly partisan environment right now how do we break that? How do we get past that? Is there a way to do that? And I just like this focus on empathy and understanding is one of the starting points. And this is something that can be built into this framework, and it's the kind of thing that we've been thinking about. So when we revise the learning goals and objectives, these are some of the considerations that we have. Someone else who's out there who's been doing some really great work on fake news and looking at this from a library information science perspective is Nicole Cook. And we're very excited that she's actually writing a chapter for us for our next book on meta-literate learning in the post-truth world. And she talks about meta-literacy and meta-literate learning as a response to this. So if you look at what she's talking about, it's this emphasis on critical engagement, which has been a part of meta-literacy from the start, being able to make contributions, being able to produce information ethically and responsible, and be able to really navigate these kinds of spaces that, as she says, are riddled with fake news, alternative facts, biases, and counter-knowledge. So we really appreciate that emphasis from Nicole, and she's going to be writing about it further in our next book. But that's an excellent article that I would also really strongly suggest.
So this is goal number 2 from the revised meta-literacy learning goals and objectives. And it addresses sort of a wide range of issues that are involved with engaging with all intellectual property ethically and responsibly. So issues such as differentiating between new creations and remixing, using the work of others, using that work ethically when you're remixing or reusing it, deciding upon the licensing of your own work, and the impact that will have about that it will have upon others as they're thinking about using it themselves. Conscious decisions about the information that you are sharing online, whether it's information about yourself or about others, and also following established methods of intellectual property attribution, depending upon the environment that you're working in. And this produce and share information in collaborative and participatory environments is goal number 3. And it's an important objective that we and all learners see ourselves as information producers and understand the environments in which we're doing that production so that we're doing it appropriately. And I just wanted to explain sort of the background image here. This is an image of a booklet that we produced for a very recent editathon. It was actually on Monday at the University at Albany Libraries, and it was in conjunction with the Art and Feminism Project, where they're encouraging people to add contributions about women artists to Wikipedia, because it's been found that approximately 90% of Wikipedia editors are male, and that affects the material that is added to Wikipedia. And the people that we had at this event were mostly new editors, and it was really exciting to see sort of the palpable engagement as they were contributing things. Just one side note, one person had written a very nice entry on a woman artist and got a flag that this was not a notable individual and it might be eliminated. And the person who was contributing this information was really rather upset, but he sort of went forward, added some of the galleries that had exhibited her work, and was just delighted when some other sort of longtime editor on Wikipedia said, no, this is fine, and took that warning off with it. So it really showed the sort of production process and what might be happening on the other end.
And we were just talking too about it. There's another article that just came out this week, an opinion piece, that really shows how even Wikipedia is changing. The perceptions of Wikipedia is changing because of that community-based editorial aspect. So we have to be very careful that in these environments we just don't automatically work against sort of what were some of the original aspirations of social environments where people can create. So clearly Wikipedia still has a long way to go in terms of who's writing and editing for them. But you know, there was a time when And I think this still happens where faculty don't want students, referring to Wikipedia and it's seen as this terrible thing. But look at the kinds of community-based editorial controls that really allow that space to become an effective source for information. And it was really certainly challenged in 2005 when the John Siegenthaler hoax happened, and it really showed how easily you can just put fake information on a Wikipedia space. But then there were checks and balances that allowed them to be corrected. So it's something we have to really think about, and I think these ideas of producing and sharing information, which have been key to meta-literacy from the beginning, we continue to foreground that within this new context of the post-truth world. And of course, I'm sure everyone has heard about this situation that's happened with Cambridge Analytica really using data from unwittingly using, they were doing it wittingly, but from unwittingly from Facebook users. Originally, the estimate was 50 million, and then now it's up to over 70. Facebook has actually admitted that it's over 87 million Facebook users had their data stolen from Cambridge Analytica to then be manipulated for political purposes. And as we found out this week, and we're learning more and more about this, Facebook users, more and more information is stored and shared with third-party sites and everything else, much more than I think people realize. So even though we've certainly all bought into this, and we're posting pictures and sharing where we are, and we have status updates, and we're clicking on different things, I think there is a change now in terms of people being much more aware of what is happening with that, and a different kind of awareness about personal privacy. So while this idea was embedded in the original goals and objectives, we've really just tried to make it as direct and as clear as possible that we all need to protect personal privacy and also actively secure online information. So very simple to the point, we have to come up with a lot of strategies together in terms of how we do that, so how we prepare learners and really all of us to be much more critical consumers and producers of information. We've discussed a lot this emphasis on information creation as being important. We're now going to move into some definitions of information literacy, meta-literacy, how it's been evolving, and really looking at meta-literacy as this, information creation, collaborative and participatory aspect, and how that's especially relevant now, considering some of the challenges that we're facing.
So the impetus for this movement towards meta-literacy came about, we started talking about this about 2010, and at the time, the definition of information literacy was one that was much more focused on the consumer of information rather than the producer of information. It really hadn't kept up with sort of the changing information environment. There was also an emphasis on the cognitive learning domain and the behavioral. And at the time, there was ACRL information literacy standards, which were very sort of strictly enumerated, what it is you would be able to do as an information literate person. And it just didn't seem to fit the environment that we were seeing.
So if you look at, we've already discussed some of these, but this is really what we were trying to push toward in that original piece. So there's an emphasis on critical thinking, which is universally important, of course, but also critical thinking and collaboration. Can you teach collaboration? What is that like? We're in these social media spaces, online communities. How do you emphasize that? That's something that really has to be brought into our learning environments. It's also a framework that, again, this emphasis on participation. So we're in these participatory social media environments. Really, let's give some thought to how that works and how people are actively participating. And then also trying to go beyond sort of just finding information and using it to also producing, sharing it, and also thinking beyond skills development, so that we're really thinking about producing, sharing knowledge in these collaborative online communities. So again, looking at the post-truth world, we're not exactly seeing that. We're seeing the opposite. We're seeing sort of misinformation, misleading information. We're seeing people together in the communities and not looking at other communities, so they're in these echo chambers. So it didn't exactly turn out the way we thought, but these are really still key characteristics and competencies to be really focusing on, especially considering what's taking place.
And I mentioned that the information literacy definition, when we started working on this, was the reason that we started working on it. But many of you are familiar with the new ACRL, Association of College and Research Libraries framework for information literacy. And meta-literacy has now had an impact on that definition.
So as the idea developed, and we've really been giving some thought to this, we know that the technologies are always changing, the information environments are always changing. So we do have this emphasis on adaptability to information environments and change. And we really see it as more of a critical adaptability. It's not just adapting to however that particular platform or system is designed. But we know through teaching that sometimes learners are maybe a little, even though they might have the latest technology gadgets, there might be some fear there, especially in terms of producing information, being active in these kinds of spaces. So there's still an emphasis on adaptability, which would provide deeper insights into how the systems work. So for example, Facebook, adapting to that is not just using it, but it's really asking some deeper questions. I think deeper questions that people are asking now in terms of, well, how much of my information is shared? How much is stored? How much is shared? How does that work? I think we're hearing now more and more people are curious about that. So this idea of adaptability, there's a lot to unpack there, but I think that's critically important because it really does lead to all this idea of critical reflection and understanding that the environments are always evolving, they're always changing. For example, they've gone to obviously mobile devices, so that was a significant change that we've adapted to, but I think it also raises some key questions, and that will always happen, as we know, with technology.
And meta-literacy applies to all stages of life. So it's something that's important when one's in college or university. Information literacy often has a focus sort of on that academic setting, although it also says that it's a lifelong ability. But with meta-literacy, we know that our students are not just using academic resources now, they're using all sorts of resources. And so it's something that's really important sort of for the continuum of life.
And this was an idea really that was inspired by a faculty member that we were working with who pointed out to us that the meta, we've been talking a lot about it, meta in terms of metacognition. He was really talking about the origins of the word also meaning after. So this inspired this idea that of kind of how does meta-literacy fit in with this continuum of literacy itself. So basically, literacy has always been focused on reading and writing. Information literacy really was about search and retrieval. And now the new one goes beyond that, but sort of what happens beyond those competencies. That's really, I think, what we're talking about. So that once you effectively read and write and you can search and retrieve and you can do all those things, what are some of these other sort of competencies that you need? And also, this is important too because as we think about metacognition, it's really thinking about your own thinking, it's about self-regulating your learning, and this idea too of empowering students to think about their own literacy. That's really where the empowerment comes in. So it's not just being actively producing, but it's also being able to reflect, to self-regulate, to understand where the gaps in knowledge occur. One of the objectives too is even understanding that through the process of failing that we learn new things, we gain new insights. It's okay to fail, it's okay to make mistakes, but that from that is really where we gain some insight. So really empowering the learners to really be thinking about that. That's not just the responsibility of the teachers, it's really something the learners should be focusing on. Now we're going to delve into this much further.
So on here, we're going to be talking about the 4 learning domains, and the first one is the metacognitive. And that's being able to sort of regulate your own learning, think about your own learning, being able to assess sort of what it is that you're doing. So when we talk about confirmation bias earlier, we talked about the need to actually reflect on the fact that you may be doing that. The cognitive, so that's what it is that students would know upon completion of the learning. That's what has often been, that and then sort of the behavioral learning domain has often been linked to information literacy. So what you know after you've been involved in these activities, how you can apply that information, which leads to the behavioral, so how you would be able to act once you've had this learning. And what we're saying is that this cognitive and the behavioral really is not sufficient. There needs to be that self-reflection, but then there also needs to be taken into consideration how one feels about the learning. So with confirmation bias, for example, you really need to get beyond your feelings that this is right and this is what I'm going to be looking up and this other information may be wrong, as well as sort of being open to doing it. So we think that all four of them are really important, sort of a holistic look at it.
So interconnections between the four as well.
And here are the roles of a meta-literate individual. Students often don't see themselves in these roles. I work with students in my courses and I ask them about their information production, and they can talk about what it is they do for a particular class, a paper that they've written. But they don't talk a lot about other types of information production, and they don't really think of themselves that way. I talk about maybe what they're posting on social media. So it really requires more of consciousness, as we've been talking about, in order to do this. And so this shows a variety of things. One of the ones that I'm particularly interested in is translator, which is not necessarily a translator from one language to another, but rather from one audience to another. So it might be changing the level of the language. It might be changing the format of the information. Producer, publisher, author, being able to draw upon your own knowledge and expertise to share that with others, for example.
And an author, again, going beyond the traditional modes that you would do that it's not just an author of text, it's an author of images and art projects, artistic expressions, multimedia, and really, again, providing students with the resources for doing so, and to have them think of themselves as producers of this kind of information.
And on here, we just want you to take a second to think, if you teach, is there a role that you'd be interested in having your students take on? And if you're a student, is there one that you would find particularly intriguing to be asked to do within the context of a course or perhaps outside of a course? So teaching for meta-literacy. We'd like to consider some aspects of teaching that incorporate and promote meta-literacy, and then point out some connections between teaching for meta-literacy and sort of open learning, open pedagogy, which is an issue that's under discussion now. And I think is also sort of evolving in its conception. So these points come from an article that Tom, I, and two colleagues wrote. We had the unique experience of developing 3 different meta-literacy MOOCs, a connectivist one, and then 2 ex-MOOCs. And then taking that experience, this article talks about it in connection with MOOCs, but we think that these points are actually much broader than in that massive open online course experience. So this idea of fostering lifelong learning competencies for self-regulation and learner agency, and I'm going to be coming back to this a bit in connection with open pedagogy. The idea of providing a supportive pedagogy for students to take on these active roles. I think one of our most eye-opening experiences was with our Connectivist MOOC and a course that I was teaching for undergraduates. and thinking that they would love this ability to sort of take control of their own learning. It's online experience, so there are fewer in-person course sessions, and that was a great misassumption. The students really were not prepared for it in any way, and they thought that the idea of making their own connections meant making no connections because it was easier. So this supportive scaffolding is really important. Then encouraging this reflective, student-centered learning and critical engagement, key points of meta-literacy, and asking students to take ownership of their learning, which was something that was missing in that experience that I just mentioned. And this is an example that sort of illustrates the idea of a learner taking on an active role. It shows a blog that was created by a student in an information literacy course that I taught last year. And students were asked to create something that would be available to the public in connection with meta-literacy. Some of them did some things that were really pretty basic, but this student really was much more invested in it. She wrote a number of posts. She invited people to follow her, to contact her, and so she was really sort of taking on that active role and showing how it might be something that she could do in other situations to meet her own goals.
And this idea of, Trudy had mentioned this idea of learner as teacher, and again, foregrounding it, making this awareness that recognize that learners are also teachers and teach what you know or learn, and doing so particularly in the collaborative environments. And the students from Parkland have been so inspiring. They exemplify this perfectly. I think we've all been learning from them as they've taken really a national stage in terms of developing organizing the March for Our Lives, all in response to the school shooting that they all experienced. And what's interesting here, that they have been so incredibly articulate behind the microphones, and they've also effectively have been using the social technologies. So while we've seen so much happening with post-truth and misinformation easily circulating online, they have really been at the forefront showing how you can use it in a really positive way. Unfortunately, they've also been the victims of false information, where they have been attacked with false information and conspiracy theories. So again, it shows this really complex ecosystem, but they really do represent sort of this positive voice. And again, the learner really as the teacher.
So this comes from, again, the article that I wrote with Tom and our two colleagues. And what we're saying here is that this metacognition, which we've been talking about, is really extraordinarily important to encourage people to become autonomous learners, become self-regulated learners. Because if they are not reflecting on what it is they're learning, what it is they're doing, they're not going to get very far in doing it. They're not going to really expand beyond where they are right now. So, talking a little bit about open pedagogy, this is something that I've been looking into in connection with something I'm writing with Craig Gibson, who I'm going to be mentioning again in a few minutes. And the idea of open pedagogy, open learning, going beyond open educational resources. We often hear about those. There's a movement for more open textbooks to save students cost. But there's really much more to it than just these open educational resources. And they do help to explode the amount of material and ideas that are available to people. But then there is the idea in open pedagogy of making connections between them and developing communities of people who are working with some of these materials. Technology is really important to this. We've mentioned MOOCs. We're going to talk about another system that helps to provide this information freely to others. but sort of networking between them. And then there is also the idea of learner agency and choice. So with all of this that's available to us between the technologies, the sharing of information, and developing communities, it really helps to improve teaching and learning. And so many of these themes are really connected to meta-literacy. And we've always talked about sort of the open nature of meta-literacy.
I think that's what differentiated it also from the very beginning from information literacy, that there was an emphasis on open learning, open educational resources, the sharing of knowledge, even at the instructor level too, not just among learners.
So we are cognizant of time. We know we started late, but that you have things to do. So we're going to show just a very short video. It's about a minute or so. And talk a little bit more about a couple of projects and then go into the information on librarians and collaborations. So let me, and this was developed by Kelsey O'Brien. She's one of the ones that you saw as an author on that Open Praxis article. And this was the teaser for our Coursera MOOC. During the question and answer period, if you are interested, we can talk a little bit more about these MOOCs. We usually talk a bit more than we're going to today. And I know that we have someone who has gone through it and promotes it to others, so might have a chance. This other project that we've been involved with is a digital badging system, and it was developed from the meta-literacy goals and learning objectives. And there's sort of that Uber badge in the center, and then there are 4 sort of thematic badges that don't exactly mirror the 4 different learning goals, but are drawn from them. And this is a project, Tom's been involved with writing some of the content. Kelsey and I have been working very hard to implement it at the University at Albany. And a previous iteration of that has been used by about 2,000 students at the university. To enable them to learn about these topics and then to write short essays and reflect on what it is that they've been learning. And it's been used in disciplines throughout the university. So in our last section, we'd like to briefly touch on information literacy, the roles librarians plays, and then the importance of collaboration. Information literacy and meta-literacy certainly have elements in common, and particularly now with the information literacy framework that drew upon meta-literacy as well as the idea of threshold concepts. So this sort of replaced the standards that were from the year 2000 and made it a little bit more complex. And so there are 6 frames, each of which has a threshold concept at its center. So scholarship's conversation, research is inquiry. And then along with each of these threshold concepts, a frame has the idea of knowledge practices, what someone can do, and then also disposition. So here is an example of just a very brief excerpt from the scholarship as conversation frame. They also talk about what a novice learner maybe would know versus what an expert in the field would know. And these threshold concepts, sort of by definition, are ideas that are critical to a field, and once you've learned them, you really can't go back. But there's what they call a liminal period, where it's sort of difficult adjusting your thinking, moving from the way you had been operating to sort of getting it. So roles for librarians, there's lots of roles. And many of you, I think, are familiar with a lot of these, but this comes from an article Craig and I just published in Reference and User Services Quarterly, where we've been thinking too about the ideas of authority and trust and tribalism. And how do we deal with this? There's been an awful lot librarians have been doing with sort of this fake news issue, and how do you try to teach it? Tom mentioned earlier that findings show that if you try to disabuse people of something, they don't change their minds. So what we're talking about here is in connection with the information literacy framework, but the idea of coming together, bringing together sort of communities of inquiry, and these may be in conjunction with high impact learning practices, such as first-year seminars or living learning communities, but having a chance to really engage with some of these issues in a way that maybe is not happening, really having open conversations in a sort of with a sense of trust going on. And then in this article, we talk too about how one might use some of the frames from the framework with an emphasis on those knowledge practices and dispositions. Because I think we need to go in ways that are perhaps different than what we've done in the past, and something like this might be very challenging to implement, but I think we have to think big. So just some thoughts on collaboration. Tom and I have been collaborating for years, disciplinary faculty member, a librarian. We've been doing this since the early 90s in a variety of ways with looking at different things. But I think that the teaching of meta literacy, information literacy, is crucial that both librarians and faculty members be involved, because librarians typically don't have as much time with the students, and it needs to really be integrated into the course. The analysis and evaluation of information is something that can happen with a much more strength or emphasis in a course. Tom, do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, and I think this focus on sort of collaboration is so key, because it really has to be from the design of a learning environment, a learning experience forward, and not sort of the one-shot library sessions that have become so popular. And so this, if you think about all the things that could happen, it's really identifying OERs, thinking about how you would incorporate those into classes, really thinking about the instructional design piece. In our example, all the things that you've seen really have been through collaboration. So the 3 MOOCs, the digital badging system, really trying to use the emerging technologies in the way that we're talking about it with meta literacy, so being able to adapt to it, being able to use that. But it really comes from a real collaborative approach, and even beyond us, to this whole what we call the Meta Literacy Learning Collaborative, so with Kelsey O'Brien and Michelle Fort, who've really been instrumental in helping us design these really innovative spaces.
And with that, let me ask if you have any questions or comments or observations.
I've actually been working with the Wiki Education Foundation in integrating Wikipedia in the classroom for undergraduate students. And I wonder if there would be a good role of trying to put that also into an information literacy instruction course, and trying to have more people who are trying to teach information literacy, meta literacy skills, to make sure that they're aware of how Wikipedia functions, how those safeguards that we're talking about actually work, so that they can then pass it along to other students and just keep that circle going.
Yeah, I definitely think that that is important. One of my colleagues, for example, used Wikipedia's Women in Red project, which sort of identifies women who don't have entries or don't have substantive entries. And he used that as a course project where teams of students actually worked on researching these women and then adding the material to Wikipedia. And as through this process, sort of learning about how Wikipedia works, one of the things he found was that after they had done all this work and added this material, they were shocked to find that others could go in and edit it. So they sort of were starting to understand the entire process. And I think even if, of course, can't include that or a one-shot session, going in and sort of showing the history, showing the sort of the conversations behind what's going in, because often students just see the screen that has the entry and they don't see what's happening behind the scenes.
Well, and I think one of the things I struggled with, and looking back, I now know I have to change for future uses. I didn't stress hard the difference between essay research town versus Wikipedia entry town. That it has to be more neutral in voice. You're not making an argument, you're presenting facts.
Can't do original research.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's a really key relationship here between the technologies and producing information and evaluating information. We're talking about at dinner last night, some of our previous experiences, and I mentioned how when I was teaching at the University of Albany, I was incorporating things like PB Wiki, some of these wiki tools, so that students gained a better understanding of how the systems worked. Blogs, so blogs became a requirement, like in the early days of these kinds of emergent tools. And I saw not only an empowerment that, hey, I understand how this works and what it means, but also a deeper understanding of the technologies themselves. So many students, for example, thought that Wikipedia was like Britannica, online or something, and they gained a deeper understanding of how it worked. And I think that promoting this idea that as a community of users, there's responsibilities for being a digital citizen, there's responsibilities for what you produce and share, and that we can have innovative new checks and balances. So clearly, technology has changed, journalism has changed, but let's work with the environment we have, but make sure we have some of these checks and balances so that there's a community response to this. So that's why these kinds of technologies, even though we've seen these terrible things happen with how they've been inappropriately used, it's really time for now the community to take ownership of those spaces and those environments. And we really need active people who are participatory and ethical and understand it's not just a matter of putting things online or posting things, that you really have to think about what you're doing. So I think that what you're doing in terms of actually having students work in those environments is critically important.
Yes.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. Because in a sense, it's really related to my research that I'm working in this Center for Communication and Technology. And I work on detecting fake news spreading social media. And well, it's a popular topic in the computing field. And we see that in a sense, the quality of this fake news already surpassed in a level that humans are not easily distinguished whether it's a fake or a real news. So we look at this fake news event in multiple angles. One will be like the user level, because some users may be more susceptible to fake news, and they easily spread the news in their network. Another might be the pattern of fake news spreading we know that fake or more emotional negative news will spread widely and deeper in a quicker time. So we also look at that part. And third component will be the fake news content itself. And yeah, we want to identify some evidence, right, some features of those fake news content. But I think it's getting harder and harder to distinguish between these fake and real. But in this kind of education for meta literacy, I think it will help people who are more susceptible to fake news. Maybe we can change a little bit of those people to become more critically thinking about these fake news they see in social network. And this was just a comment. It's interesting.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that and for the work that you're doing as well. It's so important. And I think if people think beyond themselves and the impact that it might have on others, perhaps that might be one check on what it is that they're doing. But it is so hard because if they believe, so many send things on unthinkingly. So if we could get to some of those to think.
Yeah, we'd like to have you come up here and share your research too, because it sounds fascinating. And it definitely connects, and we need this kind of research to gain a deeper understanding of what the issues are. And that's why that one Dartmouth study is so important, because it really challenges some of what our assumptions might be about fake news and why people are gravitating toward it. You know, another thing that we discussed, I think in terms of the network, we know how easy it is, so that's a big part of it. It's just easy to just, you know, like something, share it, and that's a lot of what was happening in Facebook, because Facebook really enabled that. Another part of it we talk about too is like the packaging and sharing of information. That's something we discussed in the article that Carol mentioned, is that these things, you know, you might look at it and say, this looks totally ridiculous, how can anyone believe it? But part of it is the professional presentation, because again, the democratization of the technology, it's very easy to create things, which is wonderful, but the downside of it is you can package it and make it look like something, you know, NBC News did or BBC or whatever, because it looks good, even though the information makes no sense whatsoever. But then you have this other dimension of people gravitating toward it and believing it and not questioning it because it affirms what they already think. And there's so many vivid examples of this, especially with the Russian meddling and the kinds of, they really had a deep understanding of the emotion, the trigger points that some Americans would have to seeing certain images. And they really zeroed in on those and produced these images that are totally professional looking, I think totally ridiculous in terms of what the content conveys, but not to someone who thinks that, or to someone who believes in a particular conspiracy theory. You know, the whole Pizzagate thing and some of the ways that Hillary Clinton was visually represented in some of these fake news sites, it just affirmed what a lot of people wanted to believe. So it's really want to hear more about your research and some of the excellent points that you made. And it shows too why there has to be a complex response to it, because the issues are so complex. It's not just presenting the facts. As much as we'd like to do that, it's not just that.
One of the book chapters that will be in the forthcoming book is done by a journalist who's also, he's an adjunct faculty member, but he also is sort of the assistant newsroom editor at a newspaper. And he's been doing a lot of research on problems with photographs. So the photograph won't match the caption, and it's not just some of the more suspicious news entities that are doing this. He's actually caught it from some mainstream ones. So it just it's hard because it's coming at us from so many different angles and things that you just sort of never thought about. Will?
Thank you for a really stimulating, interesting talk. There's a lot that's going to come to mind as I'm sitting here listening to the questions and your responses to. And one question I have for you, Trudy, is you mentioned, and I caught that in one of your MOOCs that sort of left to their own devices, as it were, students didn't make connections with one another. And I thought about that and the earlier comments about echo chambers and how deep they are. And I didn't catch what you might have thought needed to be done next time to maybe facilitate those connections. Because when I think about some of the fake news and how easily it spreads, there was like an MIT study or something, it spreads faster than real news, this sort of thing. Some of these systems really promote and facilitate quick sharing without really considering or thinking. I mean, I guess that's just the way hyperlinks work, but still, I guess I kind of wanted to know what you thought about.
Certainly, but actually the problems were sort of more fundamental even than this, and that was getting the students to recognize that there was some level of responsibility on their part to really even participate in the course. So Tom and I did work up something that really sort of said, okay, that there are 2 required readings for this, and you need to do a few things, but the rest is, you're going to be making connections between those readings and this MOOC content and these guest speakers and other material that is pertinent to you. You will develop your own blog, which sort of fed into sort of the MOOC feed, and so people could sort of interact with one another that way. And so it was even just to the point of having them, some of them didn't establish blogs, some of them didn't post on blogs, most of them did no reading beyond the 2 of that. And they just really just saw this as a way to sort of abrogate responsibility rather than really becoming engaged. So I think that there would need to be some sort of foundational course that preceded the course, or some way of getting students to recognize that they had some responsibilities. Again, this was an information literacy course that was not in their major. So I think in that setting, and I did have a number of seniors, but these were seniors who were looking for a credit to graduate, not as a learning experience.
We also, I would encourage you to check out that open practice article, because that's a very specific example, and we found issues actually with all the MOOCs, and it's an issue with MOOCs because they are very self-directed. So it's something that we're trying to address. How can you be successful in MOOCs? And one of the arguments we ultimately made is that there do need to be those kinds of supports for learners in MOOCs. And everyone knows that, completion rates, for example, on MOOCs are pretty terrible. So what do you need to do to engage learners in those spaces? So that was something that we came up with. So you might get some ideas from that as well. Because I think it's an issue, certainly it was an issue with this Connectivist MOOC, and it's really an issue for all MOOCs. And we really want to be able to do creative things in the MOOC environments, because it really is an expression of open learning, it's collaborative, it's a way to expand lifelong learning, but there's also, we have to have strategies for success for the students.
I see Carol sort of moving towards us, so we would be happy to continue these conversations.
Yes, and I was going to mention, there is going to be a little reception set up outside with some refreshments, so if you've not had a chance to ask your question, you can corner them at the coffee urn.
And our emails are up here as well.
Emails are up there, but I also just want to thank you for a very interesting, I have some questions that I want to ask, so, but please join me in thanking you.
Thank you for coming, really appreciate it.
Everyone's been wonderful, so thank you very much.